Chapter 1. When Fire Meets Ice. The first time they met, it was a disaster. A beautiful, perfectly imperfect disaster. The air was thick with the scent of salt and sun-warmed sand as Evelyn Wilde stretched her arms above her head, breathing in the ocean breeze. The sky was a masterpiece of pastels, the horizon kissed by the last golden rays of daylight. She had always loved this time of day, the fleeting moment between light and darkness, where anything felt possible. "You're in my spot." The voice behind her was low, measured, and entirely unamused. Evelyn turned slowly, curiosity flickering in her bright green eyes. She found herself staring up at a man with furrowed brows and a frown so sharp it could cut glass. He stood with his arms crossed over his chest, his crisp button-down rolled up at the sleeves as if he had dressed for a business meeting but somehow ended up here, on this sun-drenched island, looking completely out of place. "And you are?" she asked, tilting her head. "Daniel Thorne," he replied without hesitation. "And that table behind you? I reserved it." Evelyn glanced over her shoulder at the rustic wooden table nestled under a palm tree. A small, leather-bound notebook sat neatly beside an untouched glass of water. The candle at the center flickered slightly in the breeze. "Ah," she mused, turning back to him. "You're one of those people who plan their entire day down to the second, aren't you?" Daniel narrowed his eyes. "And you're one of those people who never plan anything, aren't you?" She grinned. "Guilty as charged." The island resort they were on was supposed to be an escape, a place where people came to lose themselves in adventure, to break free from the constraints of their daily lives. But Evelyn got the distinct impression that Daniel Thorne was the kind of man who didn't believe in losing control, even in paradise. "Well, Daniel Thorne, your table looked lonely, so I decided to keep it company." "That's not how reservations work." She propped her chin on her hand, studying him. His stormy gray eyes flickered with irritation, but there was something else beneath the surface, something that intrigued her. "Fine," she said at last, pushing back her chair. "The table is all yours, Mr. Thorne." She stood up, her flowing sundress swaying around her legs as she gave him a mock salute. But before she could walk away, a strong gust of wind blew through the palm trees, sending the papers from his notebook scattering into the air. "Fantastic," he muttered under his breath, immediately diving after them. Evelyn didn't think. She acted. She darted forward, reaching for the papers as they tumbled across the sand. One landed near the water's edge, and she lunged for it just before the tide could claim it. When she straightened, paper in hand, she turned to find Daniel standing a few feet away, watching her with an unreadable expression. "Got it," she announced triumphantly, brushing the sand off the page. Daniel approached, his gaze flicking down to the paper before meeting her eyes. "That was unexpected," she offered. He exhaled through his nose, something between amusement and exasperation flashing across his face. "Helpful," Evelyn beamed. "Well, Mr. Thorne, I guess that means you owe me." Daniel arched a brow. "I don't do debts." "Too bad," she said breezily, "because now you're going to have to sit with me." And just like that, before Daniel could protest, she plopped back into the chair across from his. She wasn't sure why she did it. Maybe it was the challenge in his eyes, or maybe it was the fact that he looked like a man who had spent his entire life following the rules. Either way, Evelyn had made up her mind. Daniel sighed, running a hand down his face before reluctantly settling into the chair across from her. "I don't make a habit of entertaining strangers," he said. "Good thing I'm not a stranger anymore," she countered. For a long moment, they sat there, an unlikely pair. A man who lived by order and a woman who thrived in chaos. And somewhere between the crash of the waves and the flicker of candlelight, something shifted. Neither of them knew it yet, but this was the beginning of something neither of them had ever planned for. something unpredictable, something unstoppable, something that would change both of them forever. Chapter 2. Love in the Margins. The problem with Evelyn Wild, Daniel quickly realized, was that she was impossible to ignore. He told himself their first encounter was nothing more than an unfortunate accident, one that should have ended the moment she returned his runaway papers. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. For the past 3 days, she had appeared at his table. His table, like clockwork, only without any concept of time. She was never on schedule, never predictable. Sometimes she'd arrive before him, barefoot in the sand, humming a tune he didn't recognize. Other times, she would saunter in halfway through his meal, plopping down across from him with a cheeky grin as if she'd been invited. She never was. And yet, he hadn't asked her to leave. Daniel wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was the way she scribbled on napkins and receipts, doodling whimsical sketches in the margins of things most people would throw away. Or maybe it was the way she spoke, animated, unfiltered, as if the world were a story she was still writing. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the notes. The first one had appeared on the edge of his notebook after she'd borrowed his pen without asking. Daniel Thorne, champion of schedules, king of scowls. He had stared at it for a full minute before flipping the page with a sigh, determined to ignore her antics. But the next morning, another note appeared in the margin of his itinerary. Agenda for the day. Frown at the sunrise. Ignore the free-spirited menace sitting across from you. Pretend you're not enjoying this. Daniel had clenched his jaw, but he hadn't erased it. By the fourth note, breaking news, Daniel Thorne spotted smiling, probably an accident. He'd felt an unfamiliar twitch at the corner of his lips. Evelyn had noticed. "Oh my God," she'd gasped, clutching her chest. Was that an actual smile? Someone call the universe. I think it's broken. I wasn't smiling, he'd muttered, flipping the page. Sure, she drawled, propping her chin in her hand. Denial is the first stage. That was how it always went between them. Evelyn pushed, and somehow, Daniel never pushed back. It wasn't until the resort's evening bonfire that Daniel realized just how much she had started to get under his skin. The fire flickered against the dark sky, casting golden light over the circle of guests sprawled on blankets in the sand. Evelyn, of course, was at the center of it all, laughing with strangers as if she'd known them forever. She had a way of making people feel at ease, of making the world seem lighter just by existing in it. Daniel watched from the sidelines, arms crossed, debating whether he should leave. He wasn't a crowd person. He wasn't a firelight and laughter person. And yet, somehow, he was still here. Then she spotted him. Thorne. Evelyn's voice carried over the crackling flames. Get over here before I come drag you myself. Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair. The way she said his name, like it was a challenge, like she expected him to refuse, was precisely why he found himself striding toward her instead. Didn't take you for a bonfire kind of guy, she teased as he sat beside her. I'm not. Then why are you here? He opened his mouth, then closed it. He wasn't sure of the answer himself. Evelyn didn't press. Instead, she nudged a stick into his hands. Roast a marshmallow, Thorne. Live a little. Daniel eyed the marshmallow like it was a foreign object. This is ridiculous. You're ridiculous, she countered. It's a marshmallow, not a business merger. Just put it over the fire and try not to set yourself on fire. He sighed but did as she instructed. The marshmallow caught flames almost instantly, charring to a crisp. Evelyn let out a bark of laughter. Oh my God. You are a disaster at this, Daniel scowled, flicking off the burned sugar. I don't see how this is enjoyable. That's because you're doing it wrong. She reached out, her fingers brushing his as she repositioned his grip on the stick. Slow and steady, like this. His breath hitched slightly. The warmth of her touch lingered longer than it should have. For once, Daniel didn't pull away. They sat in silence as the flames danced before them, the night stretching out into something endless. Evelyn grinned, watching as he finally roasted a marshmallow without burning it. "See? You're learning," Daniel huffed. "I don't need lessons on marshmallows." "Sure you don't," she mused. "But you might need lessons on fun." He glanced at her then, really looked at her. Her eyes reflected the firelight, full of mischief and something softer beneath it. And in that moment, Daniel Thorne knew one thing with startling clarity. Evelyn Wild was going to be the most unpredictable, exhilarating mistake of his life. And he wasn't sure he wanted to stop it. Chapter 3. Between Moonlight and Morning. Daniel Thorne had a system. Wake up at precisely 5:30 a.m. Run 5 miles before the world stirred. Shower, dress, review his itinerary for the day. Breakfast at 7 a.m. sharp. Meetings, plans, efficiency. Nothing left to chance. It had always worked, until Evelyn Wild arrived in his life like a hurricane with no warning. She was chaos wrapped in charm, a contradiction he couldn't seem to avoid. She slept in until noon, wandered barefoot through the resort, and seemed to exist in a world that operated on pure instinct. And worst of all, she had somehow made herself part of his routine without him ever inviting her in. He told himself he didn't care. And yet, at precisely 7:01 a.m., Daniel found himself staring at the empty seat across from him at breakfast. The seat that, for the past 4 days, had been filled by an infuriating woman who had a habit of stealing his toast. He scowled, stirring his coffee. This was a good thing. A disruption to his schedule had been corrected. He could finally enjoy a peaceful morning without sarcastic commentary or unsolicited doodles appearing in his notebook. So why did the silence feel so wrong? He tried to focus on the spreadsheet in front of him, but his mind kept drifting. Where was she? Was she sleeping in? Off on some reckless adventure? Why did he even care? With a huff, Daniel pushed back his chair and left the dining area, determined to shake the strange restlessness creeping over him. Evelyn wasn't hard to find. She was exactly where he should have expected. On the beach, lying in a hammock, her arms draped over the sides as if she had no concept of balance or concern for gravity. A book rested open on her chest, the pages fluttering in the breeze. Daniel crossed his arms, standing over her. "Are you alive?" One of her eyes cracked open. "Barely. Why are you awake at this ungodly hour?" "It's 10 in the morning." "Exactly." She yawned, stretching like a cat. "Why are you hovering over me like a disapproving father?" Daniel exhaled sharply. "You missed breakfast." Evelyn blinked at him, a slow, teasing smile creeping onto her lips. "Were you waiting for me?" "No." She sat up, swinging her legs over the side of the hammock. "You were. Oh my God, Daniel Thorne. Did you actually miss me?" He scoffed. "Don't flatter yourself. Too late." She grinned. "You're way more fun when you pretend not to care." Daniel pinched the bridge of his nose. "You are insufferable. And you're predictable," she countered, hopping down from the hammock. "You act like you have the world all figured out, but I don't think you've ever stopped to actually live in it." Her words hit a little too close to home. "I live just fine," he replied coolly. "Sure," Evelyn said, stepping closer, her voice softer now. "But when's the last time you did something just for the hell of it? No purpose, no schedule. Just because." Daniel had no answer. Evelyn's eyes gleamed. "Come on, Thorne. Let's fix that." She took him to the docks, where a row of small boats bobbed lazily in the water. Daniel arched a brow. "You don't seriously expect me to?" "Sure." Evelyn hushed him dramatically. "Overthinking is a disease, Daniel. I'm here to cure you." Before he could protest, She grabbed his wrist and pulled him onto the boat. It rocked beneath them, and he instinctively reached for the wooden edges, his jaw tightening. Evelyn laughed. "Relax, we're not sailing into a hurricane. This is not how I spend my mornings," Daniel muttered. "Exactly the point," she said, pushing off from the dock. The boat drifted out into the open water, the resort shrinking behind them. The further they got from the shore, the quieter the world became. For once, Evelyn wasn't talking. She simply sat there, legs dangling over the edge, her fingers skimming the surface of the water. The wind tangled in her hair, strands lifting like golden ribbons in the sunlight. Daniel found himself watching her more than he watched the horizon. "You're staring," she murmured without looking at him. "You're making it hard not to." She turned then, eyes locking onto his, something unreadable passing between them. For a moment, Daniel forgot about schedules and logic and all the reasons why this, whatever this was, made no sense. Then Evelyn smiled, breaking the tension. "See? That wasn't so hard, was it?" Daniel huffed. "I still don't see the point of this." She rolled her eyes. "Not everything needs a point, Daniel. Some things just are." He wanted to argue, to tell her that everything needed a purpose. But as the boat rocked gently on the waves, the scent of salt and sun wrapping around them, Daniel found that, for once, he didn't have anything to say. Maybe, just maybe, Evelyn Wild was right. That night, when Daniel returned to his room, he found a folded piece of paper tucked into his notebook. It wasn't her usual scribbled mockery. It was a single line, written in her looping handwriting. "You spend your mornings chasing the sunrise, but have you ever watched the moon say goodnight?" Daniel stared at the note for a long time, and then, against all logic, he set his alarm for midnight. Chapter 4. The Dance of Chaos and Control. Daniel Thorne was not the kind of man who abandoned his routine on a whim. And yet, at precisely 11:58 p.m., he was standing on the beach, hands in his pockets, waiting. The ocean stretched endlessly before him, dark and restless beneath the moonlight. The resort behind him had long since gone quiet, its guests tucked into their beds, lulled by the gentle lullaby of the waves. The world felt different at this hour, unfamiliar, unscripted, much like Evelyn Wild. He checked his watch, then exhaled, shaking his head. This is ridiculous. He should be in bed. He should be resting, preparing for the next day, not chasing after cryptic notes left by a woman who had made it her mission to unravel him. But before he could turn back, a voice drifted through the night. "I was starting to think you wouldn't show." Evelyn emerged from the shadows, barefoot as usual, her dress fluttering in the breeze. Her hair was loose, cascading over her shoulders like waves mirroring the sea behind her. Daniel frowned. "You make it sound like this is a secret meeting." She grinned. "Isn't it?" He exhaled sharply. "You left a note in my room, and you followed it," she pointed out, eyes gleaming. "Progress." Daniel rolled his eyes. "Are you ever serious?" Evelyn tilted her head, considering. "Rarely." Then softer. "But I'm serious about this." She gestured for him to follow her down the shore, her footprints vanishing in the wet sand as quickly as she made them. Against his better judgment, he fell into step beside her. They walked in silence for a while, the only sound the rhythmic crash of the waves. The moon hung low in the sky, casting silver light over everything, and Daniel found himself watching Evelyn more than he watched the ocean. She was quiet tonight. No teasing, no relentless attempts to pry him from his carefully built walls. It unsettled him more than her usual chaos. "You never answered my question," she said finally. Daniel glanced at her. "Which one?" Evelyn looked up at the sky. "Have you ever watched the moon say goodnight?" Daniel followed her gaze, watching as the moon inched toward the horizon. "No," he admitted. I'm always awake before it sets, Evelyn hummed, folding her arms over her chest. That's a shame. Sunrises are all about beginnings, you know? They're hopeful, full of possibilities. But the moon, she sighed, a wistful smile touching her lips. The moon is different. It's an ending, but a gentle one. Like a whispered goodbye instead of a slammed door. Daniel studied her carefully. You talk about it like it's a person. Maybe it is, she mused. Maybe everything is. The ocean, the wind, even time. He arched a brow. And what would time say if it could speak? Evelyn looked at him then, really looked at him. And for the first time since meeting her, Daniel wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. She took a step closer, the space between them narrowing, the night wrapping around them like a secret. I think it would tell you to stop fighting it, she murmured. To stop measuring your life in schedules and checklists and start measuring it in moments. Daniel swallowed, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. I don't fight time, he said, though it sounded weak even to his own ears. Evelyn just smiled, as if she knew better. You know what your problem is, Thorn? She said, turning toward the waves. Daniel huffed. Please enlighten me. You think you have all the time in the world, she said softly. But time isn't something you keep. It's something you spend. Something about the way she said it sent a chill down his spine. For the first time in his life, Daniel Thorne wondered if he had been spending his time all wrong. They sat in the sand, watching the moon sink lower, its glow dimming as the first hints of dawn touched the horizon. Evelyn leaned back on her hands, sighing contentedly. See? Worth it, wasn't it? Daniel glanced at her, then at the sky. Maybe, he admitted. She gasped dramatically. Was that? Did you just agree with me? Mark this day in history. Daniel shook his head, but the corner of his mouth twitched. Don't get used to it. Evelyn grinned, resting her head against his shoulder as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And for some reason, Daniel didn't pull away. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about the next moment. He was simply living in this one. Chapter 5. Whispers in the dark, echoes in the light. Daniel Thorne didn't lose control. He structured his days with precision. He anticipated problems before they arose. He never gambled, never deviated from the plan, and certainly never found himself caught in the whirlwind of someone else's recklessness. And yet, here he was, gripping the edges of a speeding motorbike while Evelyn Wilde drove like she had no regard for human life. Are you trying to kill us? He shouted over the roar of the engine. Evelyn only laughed, the sound bright and wild against the wind. Oh, relax, Thorne. You're too stiff to die. Daniel scowled. That makes no sense. She ignored him, swerving sharply around a bend in the road, the tropical landscape blurring past them. They had been on this island for weeks now, and somehow, despite its idyllic beaches and calm blue waters, every encounter with Evelyn felt like a brush with disaster. The bike hit a bump, sending Daniel's grip tightening around her waist. Evelyn shot him a knowing smirk over her shoulder. See? You're learning to hold on. Daniel clenched his jaw. I swear to God, if we survive this, I am never letting you drag me into one of your ridiculous schemes again. Sure you won't, she said, teasing, as she pulled to a stop at the edge of a high cliff overlooking the ocean. Daniel swung off the bike, brushing the dust from his clothes with a deep breath, willing his heartbeat to return to something resembling normal. Evelyn, of course, was unfazed. She stretched her arms above her head, breathing in the salty air like she hadn't just risked both of their lives. Why are we here? Daniel asked, scanning the empty stretch of land. Evelyn tilted her head. I thought you'd like the view, Daniel sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. You kidnapped me from a perfectly functional morning meeting for a view? She shrugged. Meetings are overrated. Daniel let out a slow, measured breath. You don't take anything seriously, do you? Evelyn turned to him then, something unreadable in her gaze. You take everything too seriously. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind whipped through the cliffs, the ocean crashing below, and Daniel wondered, not for the first time, why she had this effect on him. Finally, Evelyn broke the silence with a grin. Come on, Thorn. It's time for your next lesson in spontaneity. Daniel frowned. I don't like the sound of that. Evelyn took a step closer, her voice dropping to a playful whisper. Have you ever jumped off a cliff before? His stomach dropped. Absolutely not. Her eyes sparkled with mischief. There's a first time for everything. Daniel took a firm step back. Not for this. Evelyn laughed, reaching for his hand. Trust me. I don't, he said flatly. She pouted. That's rude. Daniel shook his head. This is insane. Maybe, she admitted, tugging him forward. But so is spending your whole life afraid of losing control. Daniel stiffened. Evelyn smiled, softer now. You think control keeps you safe. But sometimes, Daniel, it just keeps you caged. His throat felt tight. Before he could finish, Evelyn released his hand and took a running start toward the edge. Daniel's heart lurched. Evelyn. And then she was gone. For a second, panic seized him. He rushed to the edge, peering down, ready to call for help, only to see her emerge from the waves below, laughing. That was amazing, she called up. Your turn, Thorn. Daniel closed his eyes, exhaling through his nose. This woman was going to be the death of him. But as he stood there, the wind rushing around him, her words echoed in his mind. Sometimes control just keeps you caged. Daniel Thorn did not jump off cliffs. Except, apparently, for tonight. With one last breath, he took a step forward and let go. Chapter 6, Tangled in Time. The first thing Daniel Thorn noticed when he woke up was the absence of silence. It wasn't the kind of quiet he was used to. Sterile, composed, predictable. Instead, it was alive, humming with movement and possibility. The rustling of palm leaves outside the window, the distant crash of waves against the shore, the occasional call of a bird slicing through the morning air. Even the walls seemed to breathe, warmed by the sunlight that spilled lazily through the open shutters, casting long, golden streaks across the wooden floor. For a moment, he forgot where he was. His body ached in places he hadn't known could ache, a lingering reminder of last night's reckless leap into the ocean. His lungs still held traces of salt, his skin tight from the lingering kiss of seawater. His world, so carefully constructed, had fractured in the span of a single evening, and yet he had survived. More than that, he had felt something. The memory of it was disorienting. The rush of wind tearing past him, the sheer weightlessness of falling, the startling cold that had wrapped around him the moment he hit the water. And then, the surface breaking above him, the sky exploding into view, the feeling of his own breath returning to him as if the ocean itself had decided to let him go. Evelyn had been waiting, of course, floating effortlessly, grinning as if she had known all along that he would follow. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. It should have been infuriating, the way she slipped so easily beneath his skin, rewriting the rules he had lived by without so much as a warning. He had spent his entire life mapping out the safest routes, the most efficient paths. He knew how to build a future that was stable, how to predict risks before they even materialized. And yet, Evelyn existed outside of all of that. She was a force entirely her own, uncontained and unpredictable, like a wildfire that burned through the monotony of the world around her. And somehow, against every ounce of logic he possessed, he was drawn to that fire. He pulled himself out of bed, stretching the stiffness from his muscles as he made his way to the window. The island sprawled out before him, wild and untamed in a way that had once unsettled him. Now, he saw it differently. The waves didn't just crash, they danced. The wind didn't just howl, it sang. Even the trees, standing tall and unyielding, seemed to sway in conversation with something unseen. Had all of this always been there? Had he simply never stopped long enough to notice? Outside, he could already sense Evelyn's presence somewhere. She was always moving, never still. Perhaps she was scaling the rocks by the northern shore, her laughter carrying through the wind. Or maybe she was in town, blending seamlessly into the crowd, finding stories in strangers' faces. Wherever she was living. Fully, unapologetically. Daniel frowned, his fingers tightening against the windowsill. The thought unsettled him more than it should have. He had spent years constructing a life that made sense, one built on numbers and deadlines, expectations met and exceeded. It was a life of discipline, of carefully calculated decisions. But now, for the first time, he was beginning to wonder if it had been just that, constructed. Because last night, for the briefest of moments, he had felt something real. It was terrifying, this shift within him, like standing at the edge of an abyss, knowing that once he stepped forward, there would be no way to go back. He could feel it pulling at him, that same current that Evelyn seemed to follow so effortlessly. But what did it mean? Could a man like him, rigid, methodical, unwavering, truly exist in the same world as someone like her? Or was this just the fleeting gravity of two opposing forces colliding, destined to spin apart just as suddenly as they had come together? The question lingered as he turned from the window, pushing the thought aside. But deep down, he knew it would return. Evelyn Wilde had set something in motion within him, something that couldn't be undone. And for better or worse, he wasn't sure he wanted it to be. Chapter 7. The Collector's Heart and the Wanderer's Soul. The island never slept in the way Daniel Thorne expected it to. Even in the stillness of night, it pulsed with life. Waves whispering against the shore, distant rustlings in the thick foliage, the occasional gust of wind rattling the wooden shutters of his window. There was no true silence here, only a constant rhythm, a hum of existence that refused to be contained. He had spent most of his life in cities where noise was artificial, cars blaring down crowded streets, the dull hum of conversations in glass-walled offices, the mechanical whir of devices meant to keep everything efficient, predictable. Noise there had a purpose, a function. But here, sound was something else entirely. It belonged to the earth, to the tides, to the moon that pulled the ocean toward itself in a silent, unspoken longing. Daniel lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of something nameless settle in his chest. He hadn't always been this way. So rigid, so unwilling to let the world touch him. There had been a time, long ago, when he had believed in wonder, in discovery, in the possibility of something beyond the lines he had drawn for himself. But life had a way of carving caution into a person, chiseling away at the softness until all that remained was something unyielding, something hard. It had worked for him. Until now. Until her. Evelyn Wilde had forced her way into his world like a hurricane, wrecking every carefully placed barrier, undoing him in ways he hadn't thought possible. She moved like she belonged to the wind, untethered and free, existing in the present with a reckless certainty that terrified him. She didn't plan, didn't calculate, didn't hesitate before leaping into the unknown. And somehow, impossibly, she had pulled him into it with her. Even now, he could feel the phantom weight of last night's jump clinging to him. The way the air had swallowed him whole. The way the ocean had wrapped around him like something ancient, something endless. He had expected fear, regret, anything but the wild, shattering exhilaration that had rushed through him the moment he let go. The moment he trusted. He exhaled slowly, pushing back the covers and stepping barefoot onto the cool wooden floor. Sleep would not come to him tonight. His mind was restless, tangled with thoughts he did not yet know how to name. Outside, the island stretched beneath the moon's silver glow, its edges softened by shadows. The ocean shimmered in the distance, a vast, unknowable thing, and for the first time, Daniel felt something stir within him, a quiet, aching pull towards something he could not define. His steps carried him to the shoreline before he realized he had even moved, the sand cool against his skin, the scent of salt thick in the air. The water reached for him in gentle waves, lapping at his feet like an invitation. For so long, he had fought against this, against change, against surrender. But standing here, beneath a sky full of stars, he felt something shift inside him, something inevitable. Perhaps Evelyn was right. Perhaps control was nothing more than an illusion, a chain he had willingly wrapped around himself. Perhaps the only way forward was to let go. The tide pulled back, only to return again, relentless in its pursuit. And for the first time, Daniel Thorne did not step away. Chapter 8. A Love Written in the Stars. Daniel had always believed that the future was something you could control. There was comfort in that certainty, in the belief that if you just worked hard enough, if you stuck to the plan, the world would bend to your will. Life was simple when it adhered to the predictable rhythms of cause and effect. You made your choices, and those choices shaped your reality. But standing at the water's edge, watching the ocean swallow the moonlight, Daniel found himself questioning everything he thought he knew. The island had become a place of contradictions, a sanctuary for the chaotic, a haven for the wild and untamed. It was as if the land itself existed outside of time, outside of logic, its rhythms dictated by forces beyond understanding. The wind had a voice here, the earth a heartbeat, and for the first time in his life, Daniel was beginning to hear it. The day had been quiet, the air thick with the kind of heat that left everything feeling suspended, as though the world itself were holding its breath. He had spent hours walking the perimeter of the island, allowing the oppressive stillness to settle into his bones. His mind had wandered, replaying the moments from the past week with a growing sense of disbelief. Evelyn Wild. She was a puzzle he couldn't solve, a mystery that only deepened the longer he spent with her. She existed like an element of nature, something both beautiful and destructive, always unpredictable, always demanding attention. She moved through life with a kind of fearlessness that both fascinated and terrified him. It wasn't just her spontaneity or her carelessness. It was the way she approached everything with an open heart, as though she believed the world could be a place of infinite possibility. And in a way, perhaps it could. Daniel had never allowed himself to entertain that thought. He had always believed that the world was something you shaped, something you controlled, that happiness could only be found in the careful construction of a future that made sense. But Evelyn had shown him another way. Each encounter with her had unraveled him, piece by piece, until he no longer recognized the man he had been when he first arrived on this island. The man who was afraid of making mistakes. The man who had to have everything figured out. He had always thought that control was the key to everything. But here, standing at the water's edge, he realized that maybe it wasn't. Maybe the key was in letting go. The ocean stretched endlessly before him, its vastness both intimidating and awe-inspiring. The waves crested and fell in a rhythm that was as old as time itself, and Daniel felt the pull of it deep in his chest. He felt the weight of the water, the gravity of something bigger than himself, something that could not be contained by logic or reason. The tides had a purpose all their own, driven by forces far beyond his understanding. They did not ask for permission, did not wait for the perfect moment. They simply were, moving with the certainty that no matter what, they would always return. Daniel stepped closer to the shore, feeling the coolness of the water as it lapped at his feet. He let the tide pull at him, let it remind him of how small he was in the grand expanse of everything. For the first time, he allowed himself to simply be. The pull of the ocean, the rhythm of the waves, became a lullaby, soothing him into a state of surrender. There was no need for plans, no need for expectations. Just the moment, just the now. For so long, he had tried to control everything, to anticipate every move, every outcome. But here, in the face of something so vast, so beyond his comprehension, Daniel found the freedom of release. Evelyn had always said that life wasn't about having control. It was about knowing when to let go. As the waves kissed his feet, Daniel understood. He understood, perhaps for the first time in his life, what it meant to stop resisting the world around him, to stop fighting against the current, and to simply flow. The horizon stretched out before him, endless and unknown, and for the first time, he was no longer afraid. The tides were rising, and he was ready to meet them. Chapter 9. Storms and Serenades. The sun hung low in the sky, casting the island in the kind of golden light that made everything feel suspended in time. It was the kind of evening that whispered of endings and new beginnings, where the air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to shift. Daniel stood at the edge of the cliff, his toes gripping the rough stone beneath him as he gazed out at the horizon. The ocean stretched endlessly, its surface glistening like liquid glass, undisturbed by the winds or the tide. There was a quiet stillness to it, a deep, profound peace that seemed to settle over everything. But Daniel felt none of it. Instead, there was a restlessness inside him that he couldn't escape, a sense of urgency that tugged at him like the pull of gravity. The island had become a place of contradictions, a world where nothing made sense but everything felt true. Every corner he turned, every moment he shared with Evelyn, only seemed to deepen the tension within him. He had come here to escape from the noise, from the expectations, from the life that had been carved out for him. He had come to find solace, to silence the voices that had been shouting in his head for years, demanding that he follow a path that was not his own. And yet, the more time he spent on this island, the more he realized that there was no escaping the truth of who he was. No matter how far he went, no matter how many miles of ocean he put between himself and the life he had left behind, that truth still followed him. It lingered in the corners of his mind, in the spaces between his breaths, in the way his heart beat faster whenever Evelyn was near. She had become a force in his life, one that he could neither control nor ignore. She was everywhere, woven into the fabric of every moment, a constant presence that both exhilarated and terrified him. She was the wildness in the wind, the unpredictability of the tide. She was the part of him that he had buried, the part that longed to leap without looking, to throw caution to the wind and embrace the chaos of the world. But chaos was something Daniel had never been able to embrace. He had always believed in order, in structure. He had lived a life of careful precision, where every step was measured, every decision calculated. He had spent years constructing a future that was safe, that was secure, that was free from the fear of the unknown. And yet, every day on this island, every interaction with Evelyn, chipped away at that carefully built world, revealing something beneath it, something raw and vulnerable, something that he had been too afraid to face. The sound of waves crashing against the rocks below was a constant reminder of the power that nature held, the way the earth and sea could shape the land with a force greater than any human hand. Daniel closed his eyes, allowing the sound to wash over him, to pull him into its rhythm. He had always thought that he could control his future, that he could shape it with the precision of a sculptor carving marble. But now, standing on the edge of this cliff, he realized that life was not something to be shaped. It was something to be lived. And Evelyn, with all her spontaneity, all her chaos, had shown him that. She had never been afraid of falling. In fact, she seemed to seek it out, to revel in it, to throw herself into the unknown without hesitation, as if the very act of surrender was what made life worth living. And Daniel had watched her, fascinated and frightened in equal measure, as she leaped from one moment to the next, always fully present, always willing to risk everything for the sake of experiencing something new. It was terrifying to watch her, to see her move through the world with such ease, with such certainty, but it was also freeing. For the first time in his life, Daniel found himself questioning everything he had believed to be true. Could he really live a life bound by rules and structure? Could he keep denying the pull of something greater, something wild, something untamed? The wind picked up, tugging at his hair, at his clothes, as though urging him to make a decision. The island seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for him to jump, both literally and figuratively. He had always been afraid of the leap, afraid of the unknown, of what would happen if he let go of control. But standing on this cliff, with the ocean stretching endlessly before him, Daniel felt something shift within him. He no longer saw the leap as something to be feared. Instead, it was the only way forward. He had always thought that control was the key to survival, that if he could just manage everything, if he could just keep things in line, he would be safe. But now, he saw that safety was an illusion. Life wasn't about safety. It wasn't about following a set path or staying within the lines. Life was about embracing the unknown, about surrendering to the forces that shaped the world and trusting that, no matter what, the leap was worth it. As the wind howled around him, Daniel stepped back from the edge, his heart pounding in his chest. The decision wasn't easy. It would never be easy, but it was necessary. He had to let go. He had to surrender. For the first time in his life, Daniel understood that the leap wasn't just about falling. It was about learning to fly. And with that realization, he turned and walked back toward the heart of the island, toward whatever it was that awaited him. Chapter 10. A Doorway to Forever. The morning came slowly, as it always did on the island, with the first light of dawn creeping over the horizon like a promise, soft and uncertain. There was a quiet stillness that accompanied each new day, a gentle calm that seemed to settle over everything, giving the world a brief respite from the chaos of the night. For a moment, everything felt suspended in time, untouched by the demands of reality. Daniel stood at the edge of the small garden that had become his sanctuary over the past few weeks, his bare feet sinking into the cool earth beneath him as he watched the sun rise. The island was still, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze and the distant cry of birds greeting the dawn. It was in these moments of stillness that Daniel found clarity, or at least the illusion of it. The world seemed so simple here. No expectations, no obligations, no one to answer to but himself. He could breathe without the weight of the past pressing down on him. And yet, the stillness was beginning to feel like a cage. There was an undeniable pull in the air, an unspoken tension that Daniel couldn't ignore, no matter how much he tried to lose himself in the tranquility of the island. It had been a few days since his quiet realization at the cliff's edge, but the weight of it had settled over him like a heavy fog, clouding his thoughts and pulling him deeper into uncertainty. He had accepted the idea of surrender, but now he wasn't sure what to do with it. What did it mean to truly let go? It wasn't as simple as just abandoning control, as letting go of his carefully constructed life. The truth was that he was still tethered to his old self, still trying to find a way to reconcile the person he had been with the person he was becoming. And the more time he spent here, with Evelyn, whose very presence seemed to tear down the walls he had spent so long building, the more he realized that he was standing at a precipice, one that he couldn't quite bring himself to jump off of. She was the catalyst for everything that was shifting within him. Evelyn had always been unapologetically herself, a force of nature that refused to be confined by rules or expectations. Her spontaneity was both captivating and maddening, her carefree nature a stark contrast to his own methodical approach to life. And yet, in the time they had spent together, he had come to see that there was something profound in the way she lived. She embraced the messiness of life, the unpredictability, the chaos, and she did so with an open heart. It was something that Daniel had never understood. For years, he had believed that structure was the only way to create meaning. If you just followed the steps, if you just stuck to the plan, then everything would make sense. But now, standing on the threshold of something he couldn't quite define, he was beginning to wonder if there was another way to live. It wasn't that he wanted to abandon everything he had worked for, everything he had built. It wasn't that he wanted to give up on his goals or his ambitions. But somewhere, deep within him, there was a nagging feeling that perhaps he had been chasing the wrong things. The island had shown him that there was more to life than the pursuit of control, more to existence than the careful arrangement of days and hours. The stillness of the mornings, the unpredictability of the waves, the unspoken bond that had begun to form between him and Evelyn. All of it had shattered the illusion that he could shape everything to his will. Perhaps life wasn't meant to be shaped at all. Daniel took a slow breath, the air thick with the scent of salt water and earth, and let his gaze wander across the landscape before him. The garden was lush and wild, the plants reaching for the sky with a kind of unrestrained vigor, their tendrils twisting and curling in every direction. It was a stark contrast to the carefully manicured lawns and pristine gardens he had known back home, the ones that had been arranged with precise symmetry and order. Here, the earth grew as it pleased, untamed and free. And yet, there was beauty in that freedom, a raw, unfiltered beauty that Daniel couldn't help but admire. It was the kind of beauty that didn't conform to expectations, the kind that could only exist in the absence of control. He knelt down, brushing his fingers through the rich soil, feeling the coolness of it against his skin. There was something grounding in that connection to the earth, something that reminded him of his own place in the world, however small and insignificant it may seem. For the first time, he allowed himself to just be. No plans, no agendas, no goals. Just the present moment, just the feeling of the earth beneath his hands and the steady rhythm of his breath. It was a strange kind of peace, one that came not from understanding but from simply existing within the chaos. The days on the island had taught him many things, about himself, about the world, about life. But there was one thing that he had yet to understand fully, one thing that still eluded him. Evelyn. She was a mystery, a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. And the more he tried to understand her, the more he realized that perhaps she wasn't meant to be understood at all. She was the embodiment of everything he had been afraid of: spontaneity, unpredictability, freedom. And yet, she was also the very thing he needed. It was in the way she lived, in the way she moved through the world with such grace and abandon, that Daniel found the greatest lesson of all. Life wasn't meant to be controlled. It wasn't meant to be boxed in or neatly packaged into a predictable narrative. It was meant to be lived, to be felt, to be experienced, to be embraced in all its messy, beautiful, unpredictable glory. And maybe, just maybe, that was the key to understanding her. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting its warm glow over the island, Daniel stood up, his heart light with the realization that there was still so much more to discover. He didn't have all the answers, and he didn't need to. The journey was the answer. And for the first time, he felt ready to take the next step. Chapter 11. The Language of Opposites. The island had never felt so vast to Daniel as it did now. Each morning, the light seemed to stretch further, painting the landscape in hues of orange and pink, casting long shadows that seemed to reach into the deepest corners of his mind. Time itself appeared to unravel, moving with a languid slowness that both comforted and unsettled him. The days drifted by, one after another, their boundaries blurring together until they no longer felt like separate moments, but rather parts of a single, continuous experience. It was the kind of place that made you feel as though you were both nowhere and everywhere at once. A place where the past and future collided, where the present was all there was. And yet, despite the stillness that surrounded him, there was a quiet urgency in the air, a sense that something was waiting just beyond the horizon, something that could change everything. Daniel had spent the last few days walking the island, letting his feet take him wherever they wanted to go. There was no particular destination in mind, no goal or purpose, just the simple act of moving through the world. He found himself drawn to the wild, untamed places, the dense forest where the trees seemed to whisper secrets in the wind, the cliffs that jutted out over the ocean like sentinels standing watch over the endless expanse of water. It was as if the island itself was calling to him, urging him to explore, to uncover the hidden truths that lay buried beneath its surface. But even as he ventured deeper into the island's heart, there was a part of him that remained tethered to the shore, to the place where he had first arrived, to the small house that had become both a refuge and a prison. It was there that he had first begun to confront the tension within himself, the quiet war between the man he had been and the man he was becoming. The island had shown him the possibility of something different, but it hadn't yet told him what that difference meant. Evelyn had always been the one to push him toward it, the one to challenge him in ways that both irritated and fascinated him. Her presence was a constant reminder that life was not meant to be controlled, that the rules he had built his world on were nothing more than illusions. She had shown him a different way of being, a way that was both terrifying and liberating. And yet, even as he began to embrace the idea of surrender, of allowing himself to be swept up in the current of life, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he still needed to understand about her, something that eluded him no matter how much he observed, no matter how deeply he tried to see. It was a question that hung in the air like the scent of salt water on the breeze, unspoken but always present. What did Evelyn really want? She was a force, a whirlwind of energy and possibility, a woman who seemed to exist outside of the constraints of time and space. She didn't follow the same rules as everyone else. She didn't seem to care about the same things. And yet, there was something about her that drew him in, something that kept him coming back, even when the very nature of their differences seemed impossible to reconcile. He had always been someone who needed structure, someone who found comfort in routine. His life had been carefully planned, each decision made with precision, each step taken with purpose. But Evelyn was the antithesis of that. She was spontaneous, unpredictable, a creature of the moment, and the more time Daniel spent with her, the more he realized that he was being forced to confront the very thing that he had spent his life avoiding, the unknown. The unknown was terrifying. It was messy, chaotic, uncontrollable. It was everything that Daniel had feared, everything that he had worked so hard to avoid. But standing on this island, amidst the wildness of nature, he found himself wondering if perhaps the unknown wasn't as dangerous as he had once believed. Perhaps it was the only thing worth embracing. The island, with its untamed beauty and its quiet, persistent pull, had a way of forcing you to face your fears, to confront the parts of yourself that you had long buried. The more Daniel allowed himself to be immersed in its rhythms, the more he began to understand that it wasn't the island that was challenging him. It was himself. It was the man he had been, the man who had built walls to protect himself, who had clung to certainty and control as though they were his only means of survival. And now, those walls were beginning to crumble. Daniel walked toward the cliffs again, his footsteps slow and deliberate, as though he were savoring each step. The sky above was heavy with clouds, the kind that seemed to promise rain, and the wind had picked up, carrying with it the scent of the sea and the earth. It was a different kind of stillness today, one that felt charged, like the air before a storm. He stood at the edge of the cliff, looking out over the vast expanse of ocean. The water below was darker than usual, its surface roiling with the force of the wind. The waves crashed against the rocks, sending spray into the air like mist. There was something raw and powerful in the way the ocean moved, something that called to him, something that stirred something deep inside. It was a reminder, once again, of the force of nature, of the unpredictability of life. The ocean did not care for structure. It did not follow rules. It existed in a constant state of flux, forever changing, forever moving. And yet, despite its chaos, there was a certain harmony to it, a rhythm that could be felt in the ebb and flow of the tide, in the way the waves rose and fell in perfect succession. Perhaps that was what he needed to understand. Perhaps life wasn't about finding order in the chaos, but about learning to move with it, to flow with it, to find balance in the midst of the storm. The more Daniel reflected on it, the more he realized that this was the lesson the island had been trying to teach him all along. It wasn't about control. It wasn't about structure. It was about surrendering to the current, trusting that the journey would take him exactly where he needed to go, even if he couldn't see the destination. And as he stood on the edge of the cliff, with the wind howling in his ears and the ocean crashing below, Daniel felt a sense of peace that he had never known before. He didn't have all the answers, and he didn't need to. What mattered now was that he was learning to let go, learning to embrace the unknown. And that, he realized, was enough. Chapter 12. When the past knocks twice. The island had become an unspoken ritual for Daniel, a place where time didn't press him, where his thoughts wandered as freely as the wind through the trees. Yet, there was a part of him, deep inside, that could not escape the shifting tension between him and Evelyn. It had been there, growing gradually, like the slow change of seasons. The peaceful surface of their interactions had begun to ripple, hinting at an undercurrent neither of them had been willing to confront. For days now, Daniel had spent most of his waking hours trying to make sense of it. The island, with its wild beauty and untamed edges, seemed to reflect everything that he both loved and feared. He had learned to embrace the wilderness of the place. Yet when he tried to draw closer to Evelyn, he found himself caught between her unpredictable nature and his need for structure. She was like the sea itself, vast, unpredictable, and always in motion. He had stood on the edge of it so many times, watching it swirl below him, thinking that one day he might finally understand its rhythm, its secret flow. But each time, it felt like an endless mystery. The air was thicker than usual as Daniel walked along the cliffs, his feet steady against the earth, yet his mind adrift, as if he, too, were trying to find his balance. The breeze carried the scent of salt water, and the sky was heavy with clouds, the kind that threatened a storm but never quite followed through. It had been like this for hours, the feeling that something was waiting, that something was about to happen, but without any real indication of what that might be. The island seemed to mirror his own internal unrest, as though it, too, were holding its breath. The sun, low on the horizon, cast long shadows across the landscape, and the world was bathed in that strange, fading light. The moment between day and night, between clarity and confusion. He had walked this path so many times, but today it felt different. Today, there was a palpable weight to the air. Everything seemed to be suspended in time. Evelyn, for all her unpredictability, was like this. A storm quietly brewing in the distance, ready to sweep in and change everything. The problem was that he wasn't sure if he was ready for the storm. He had spent so long constructing his world with rules and rituals, his precise mornings, his meticulous routines. He had kept himself in a bubble, safe from the chaos he feared. But now, with Evelyn, he was being forced to face it all. And worse yet, he wasn't sure if he wanted to face it. In the stillness of the evening, Daniel turned toward the narrow path leading through the dense forest. His steps were slower now, more deliberate, as if the rhythm of his walk might help him sort through the jumble of thoughts clouding his mind. The forest had always been an escape for him, its shadows offering solace, its quiet a refuge from the world. But now, even the peacefulness of the woods seemed to echo his sense of disarray. He couldn't shake the feeling that the island itself was alive, that it was watching him, waiting to reveal something. He paused, taking a deep breath, and it was then, in that suspended moment, that he felt a shift. It was subtle at first, a lightness in his chest, like a heavy weight being lifted. The tension in his mind began to unravel, each thought loosening its grip as he exhaled. He had spent so long searching for answers, for a clear path through the confusion of his emotions, but in that moment, he realized something. The answers weren't meant to come in the way he had expected. They weren't meant to be figured out through logic or planning. They were to be discovered, like the island itself, by living through the mess, by embracing the unknown. He continued walking, his pace unhurried, as if time had no bearing on his steps. The forest opened up ahead of him, revealing a clearing where the sky could be seen in all its expansive glory. The clouds were shifting, the first few raindrops already falling from the sky. But it wasn't the rain that captured his attention. It was the horizon. The way the light was shifting, the way the world seemed to hold its breath. It was then that he thought of Evelyn again. Her presence was always like this, an undercurrent, pulling at him in ways he could never fully explain. He didn't understand her, not in the way he thought he should, but that was part of the attraction. She was a mystery, a contradiction, and in trying to understand her, he realized he was also trying to understand himself. She made him feel things he had never known existed, emotions that were raw and wild and uncontained. She made him face the world without the safety of his structure, without the comfort of his carefully laid plans. And while he fought against it, there was something inside of him that knew with a certainty deeper than any logic, that it was exactly what he needed. As the rain began to fall, heavier now, he stood there in the clearing, letting the drops soak through his shirt. It wasn't a cleansing ray. It wasn't a storm of catharsis. It was just a rain, quiet, persistent, the kind that didn't ask for anything but simply existed, as everything else did. In that moment, Daniel let himself stand in the rain, feeling the cold water drip down his face, feeling the earth beneath him. The tension that had been building within him seemed to ease, not because of anything he had done, but because, for the first time, he had allowed himself to simply exist. He didn't need to have everything figured out. He didn't need to control everything. The storm, the island, and Evelyn, they would all come to him in their own time. And for the first time, he was ready to embrace them all. As the rain soaked through his clothes, the sky above finally broke open. The storm that had been brewing now fully unleashed, the wind and rain crashing down like a long-awaited release. Daniel closed his eyes and tilted his head back, letting the storm wash over him. He had never known peace like this. Peace in the midst of chaos, peace in the face of everything he had feared. He wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, or how he and Evelyn would navigate the storm that had been quietly brewing between them. But for now, standing in the heart of the island, he knew one thing for certain. He was ready for it all. And with that knowledge came a quiet sense of belonging, as if, in that moment, he had finally come home. Chapter 13. The Art of Loving the Unfinished. It was the quiet moments that seemed to unravel everything. Daniel had always thought of himself as someone who understood the rhythm of life. He could predict patterns with a precision that made him feel secure, whether it was the way the tides followed the moon, the way the seasons came and went, or the way his thoughts fit neatly into boxes of logic. But there were moments when the world defied every expectation, moments when the chaos was so vast, so uncontainable, that it left him standing on the edge, unsure of how to move forward. And now, standing on the balcony overlooking the vast expanse of the island, he found himself caught in one of those moments. The sky above was a dull, oppressive gray, and the ocean stretched out before him like a blanket of restless possibility. The storm from the night before had passed, but its traces lingered in the air, thick and heavy, as though the island was still holding its breath. The air smelled fresh but sharp, a reminder of how nature could change in an instant. Yet despite the storm having passed, something had shifted within Daniel, something that left him feeling unsettled and distant. Evelyn had been different, too. There was something about her presence that had always been unpredictable, but it was more than that now. There was a strange sense of withdrawal in her, a silence that echoed between them like an unseen barrier. It wasn't just the usual unpredictability that he had grown accustomed to. No, this was something new, something deeper, and it unsettled him in ways he hadn't expected. They had always been opposites in many ways. That was part of the allure. He was the planner. She was the free spirit. He lived in the world of rules and structure. She in the world of fluidity and spontaneity. And somehow, despite their differences, they had found a way to coexist. But now, with the tension that had been building for days, something was different. The distance between them was more than just physical. It was emotional, as if they were two parallel lines that would never quite meet, despite being drawn so close together. Daniel stood at the railing, the cool breeze brushing against his face, and he wondered how they had arrived here. How had everything that had once felt so effortless, so natural, now become so strained? Was it the constant push and pull of their opposing personalities? Was it the weight of their differences finally taking its toll? Or was it something deeper, a fear they both shared but had never dared to voice? The silence between them had become suffocating. In the past, there had been an unspoken understanding, a shared rhythm that had kept things flowing smoothly. They had learned to navigate each other's quirks, to adapt in ways that felt almost seamless. But now, the silence felt like an impassable chasm, too wide to cross, too deep to ignore. Evelyn had retreated into herself, spending her days wandering the island in ways that Daniel could no longer follow. She had always been a wanderer, in both the literal and metaphorical sense, but lately, it seemed like she was walking further away from him, as though the island itself had become a place of escape. He watched her from a distance, from the windows of their shared space, noting how her once bright eyes now seemed clouded with something that he couldn't quite identify. It wasn't sadness, but it wasn't contentment either. It was a sense of withdrawal, as if she were carrying a burden that he couldn't see but could feel. He could have asked her what was wrong, but something stopped him. Perhaps it was the fear that asking would make it real, that naming the distance between them would only make it grow. Or perhaps it was the fear that he wouldn't know how to fix it. He had always prided himself on being someone who could solve problems, who could find the answers when others struggled. But when it came to Evelyn, there were no clear solutions, no tidy answers that he could impose. She was a force of nature, and he, no matter how hard he tried, couldn't contain her. The contradiction between them had always been part of the magic. She was the hurricane, and he was the calm that tried to make sense of it all. But what happened when the hurricane no longer raged? What happened when the chaos gave way to a different kind of stillness, one that neither of them understood? Daniel took a deep breath, pushing the confusion aside as best he could. He could feel the weight of the air pressing in on him, but he couldn't decide if it was the island or his own uncertainty that was making him feel so heavy. He had always believed that in the presence of love, everything would eventually fall into place. He had been so sure that their differences would complement each other, that they would find a way to grow together despite the ways they seemed so out of sync. But now, With the distance between them widening, he wasn't so sure anymore. As the day stretched on and the sky turned a deeper shade of gray, Daniel found himself walking aimlessly through the house, his mind racing but his body still. He had to find something to do, something to break the tension, but nothing seemed to hold his attention. He wandered into the kitchen, his fingers brushing over the counter as though it could provide some kind of answer, some kind of distraction. But the silence remained, a constant companion that gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. It wasn't just Evelyn's absence that weighed on him. It was the realization that he had let something slip away without even knowing how or when it happened. He had been so focused on the structure of his life, on the careful precision with which he had built his world, that he had failed to see the cracks appearing between him and the one person who had once made his world feel whole. The storm had passed, but the aftermath lingered in the air. There was no clarity, no neat resolution, just the lingering question of whether they could find their way back to each other. In the quiet of the house, with the sound of the waves crashing against the shore in the distance, Daniel closed his eyes, hoping for the kind of clarity that he had once believed was inevitable. But even as he stood there, waiting for some sign, he knew deep down that the answers he sought were not out there in the world. They were in the spaces between them, those unspoken gaps that neither of them was willing to bridge. And so, he stood there, suspended in time, knowing that the next step would have to come from within. But for now, there was nothing to do but wait, and let the storm continue its quiet path through their lives. Chapter 14. A Kiss Across Time and Distance. Time moved in strange ways on the island. What seemed like days stretched into weeks, and the space between moments became a blur. Daniel had learned to live with the ebb and flow of the world around him. But now, amidst the uncertain space between him and Evelyn, time felt like an ever-present weight, a force that pressed down upon him without mercy. The island, with its swaying palms and endless sky, had always been a place of refuge, a place where both of them could be free from the noise of the world. Yet, now it felt like a stage for an unspoken performance, one where the actors were too distant to truly connect. It wasn't just that Evelyn had withdrawn into herself. It was that the very essence of their shared existence had shifted. The island, which had once been a place of sanctuary, had now become a quiet reminder of everything that had gone wrong. The mornings were the hardest. Every day, as the first rays of sunlight cut through the curtains, Daniel would wake to the sound of the waves crashing against the shore. The sun would rise slowly, casting a golden glow over the landscape. But that beauty now seemed tinged with a sense of something lost. It was as though the light itself carried a sadness, one that could not be shaken. He would make his coffee, the ritual mechanical, as if the simple act of preparing it could provide some semblance of normalcy. But even that felt hollow. The small details, the little comforts he once held on to, had all become tainted by the absence of something he couldn't quite name. And yet, there were moments when he would catch a glimpse of her, Evelyn, her form silhouetted against the horizon, moving in her usual fluid manner, her steps light and carefree. But it was in those moments that he realized how much the island had come to symbolize their relationship. It was vast, open, and full of potential, yet it was also empty in its expansiveness. Evelyn seemed to float through it, untethered, while he remained, anchored by routines and expectations. What they had once shared, the quiet companionship, the shared understanding of their differences, had seemed like a delicate dance, a fluid balance of opposites. But now, that dance felt offbeat, as though they were no longer in sync. She moved with the ease of the wind, while he stood still, watching, unable to move in the same direction. They had been two forces in constant tension, yet there had always been harmony in the discord. Now, that harmony had shattered, leaving only the discord, raw and unyielding. Even the smallest of gestures seemed to carry weight. The notes they had once left for each other, those sweet, spontaneous acts of affection, had turned into something else. The words, once a simple expression of love and humor, had grown heavy with unspoken meaning. Daniel would find the notes she left behind, folded with the same care she always had, but the words felt distant, as though they came from a place he could no longer reach. And he, in turn, would leave his own, hoping for some recognition, some sign that they were still connected in the ways they had been before. The days passed, each one marked by the same quiet rhythm. Daniel would walk the paths they had once shared, but now they seemed unfamiliar, as though the island itself had shifted along with their relationship. The places they had visited together, the small, hidden coves where they had shared moments of peace, no longer held the same magic. Instead, they felt like remnants of a past that no longer fit into the present. He couldn't understand it. There had been no single event that had caused the change, no catastrophic moment that had torn them apart. It had been a slow unraveling, a quiet shift that had crept in like the tide, pulling them further and further from each other without either of them realizing it. But now, as he walked the familiar paths, he felt the distance between them as if it were a physical barrier, something that had been placed there by forces they both refused to confront. Evelyn was still there, still part of his world, but she felt unreachable. It was as though the more he tried to connect with her, the more she slipped away, and he, in turn, began to retreat into himself. He had always been a person of control, of structure, but the uncertainty of the situation left him grasping for something, anything that could anchor him. He threw himself into his work, into the small tasks that had once brought him satisfaction. But even these too had become hollow. The evenings were no better. The sun would set, and the sky would burn with the colors of twilight, fiery oranges and deep purples. But the beauty seemed muted. It was a reminder of the passage of time, and yet it felt as though time had stopped altogether. In the quiet of the night, the space between them felt even more pronounced. The island, once a place of shared laughter and connection, now felt like a vast desert with no oasis in sight. The distance between them seemed endless, and the silence was deafening. Daniel would sit on the porch, watching as the stars began to fill the sky. He had always been drawn to the stars, those small, distant points of light that seemed to hold secrets beyond human comprehension. But tonight, they offered no comfort. Instead, they reminded him of the vastness of the universe and the tiny, fragile nature of their existence within it. Were they like the stars, so far apart, yet still connected by invisible forces? Or were they something else entirely, two ships lost at sea, their paths destined to never cross again? As the night stretched on, Daniel felt the weight of everything pressing down on him. He had always believed that their differences were what made them stronger, that their opposing natures complemented each other in ways that others couldn't understand. But now, those differences seemed to be the very thing that kept them apart. He had never felt so alone, even when she was just a few rooms away. The island, for all its beauty and allure, had become a prison. It was a place of endless potential, yes, but also a place of silence and distance, and Daniel couldn't help but wonder. Was it the island that had changed, or had it been them all along? As the night deepened and the stars burned bright overhead, Daniel sat in the stillness, waiting for something to shift, for something to change. But as the hours passed, he realized that perhaps it wasn't the world around him that needed to change. Perhaps it was him. The way he had held on so tightly to what had once worked, the way he had failed to see the cracks forming beneath the surface. And as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Daniel knew that there was no easy answer, no tidy resolution, only the quiet certainty that things would never be the same. Chapter 15. two halves of a broken clock. There was a stillness in the air that had settled like a thick fog, one that wasn't tangible but nonetheless heavy, pressing in on everything. It was the kind of stillness that happens when something vital is hanging in the balance, when both sides are waiting but neither is willing to make the first move. The days had grown long in their silence, the hours stretching endlessly as Daniel and Evelyn remained caught in a web of their own making, woven from the threads of past choices and unspoken words. The island had never seemed so vast, so sprawling. It was as if the landscape itself was expanding, its endless horizon echoing the growing space between them. The beauty of the ocean, with its rhythm of crashing waves and sparkling foam, no longer held its calming effect. Instead, it felt like an eternal reminder of the distance that had crept in, a reminder that things were no longer as they had been. Daniel spent his days walking the island in solitude, as he had done before, but now there was a sense of aimlessness to his steps. Where once he had walked with purpose, enjoying the solitude, now he wandered without direction, his thoughts heavy and clouded. His mind kept returning to the same question. How had they gotten here? It wasn't that the love between them had been extinguished. No, it was still there, alive and pulsing beneath the surface, but something had shifted. It wasn't just the differences between them. It was the realization that they had come to a place where those differences were no longer points of interest but barriers, obstacles too great to ignore. Everywhere Daniel looked, there were traces of what had been. The path they had carved through the jungle, the small table by the window where they had shared countless meals and moments of laughter, the small spot by the beach where Evelyn had once taught him how to skip stones. Each of these places was a testament to their connection, to the life they had built together. But now, those places only served as painful reminders. They had become symbols of something lost, something broken. And yet, it wasn't just the island that had changed. It was their own inner landscapes, shifting in ways that neither of them had anticipated. The things that once made them strong as individuals, their unique qualities, had now become the very things that pushed them apart. Daniel had always taken comfort in his routines, his planning, his sense of order in a chaotic world. Evelyn, in her wildness and spontaneity, had always been the breath of fresh air that shook him from his rigid habits. He had loved that about her, loved how she had helped him see the world in a different light. But now, her unpredictability made him uneasy, made him question everything he thought he knew. Evelyn, too, had been changed. The carefree spirit who had once embraced the world with open arms now seemed withdrawn, lost in her own thoughts. Where once her laughter had filled the air, now there was only silence. The warmth in her eyes, which had always been a beacon for Daniel, now seemed distant, clouded with something he couldn't understand. It was as if she was a shadow of the person she had once been, and that shadow was slowly growing larger, consuming everything in its path. The mornings had become the hardest for Daniel. He would wake to find the bed beside him cold, the sheets unruffled, as if Evelyn had slipped away before the first light of dawn. He had learned to live with the silence, but it gnawed at him, a constant reminder of the distance between them. Even the simple act of making breakfast, a ritual they had shared for so long, now felt like a hollow routine. He would sit at the table alone, the food cold and untouched, his thoughts a jumbled mess of doubt and longing. There were times, late at night, when he would lie awake and listen for the sound of her breathing, for the soft rustle of her movements in the next room. But those sounds, which had once been a comfort, now seemed like a distant echo, a memory of something that had once been. The space between them in the dark was more than physical. It was an emotional chasm that neither of them seemed willing to cross. In the quiet, Daniel began to reflect on the times when they had been in perfect harmony, when they had been able to navigate their differences with ease. Those moments felt like a dream now, a distant memory that he couldn't quite grasp. He remembered the way Evelyn had looked at him with that sparkle in her eye, the way she had challenged him to step outside his comfort zone, to embrace the unknown. But he also remembered the fear that had always lurked beneath the surface, the fear that her free-spirited nature would eventually pull her too far away from him, that she would one day slip through his fingers like sand. And now, it seemed, that fear was becoming a reality. She was slipping away, slowly but surely, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The island, which had once been a symbol of their love, had now become a prison. It was a place where they were forced to confront their own inner turmoil, to face the truth of what had been and what was no longer. The beauty of the landscape, once so captivating, now felt like a cruel joke, a reminder of everything they had lost. Days passed, and still the silence remained. Daniel would find himself lost in thought, caught between memories of the past and the painful awareness of the present. He longed for the days when they had laughed together, when their differences had seemed like playful banter rather than sources of tension. But those days seemed so far away, as though they belonged to a different time, a different version of themselves. The weight of the unspoken words between them grew heavier with each passing day. The things they hadn't said, the feelings they hadn't acknowledged, hung in the air like a thick fog. And as much as Daniel wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap between them, he couldn't bring himself to do it. There was a sense of finality to their silence, a feeling that they had reached a point of no return, a point where words could no longer fix what had been broken. The island, once a place of solace, had become a place of reckoning, and Daniel couldn't help but wonder, was this the end? Had they come to a point where their love, so wild and untamed, had finally burned out? Or was there still something left, something that could reignite the spark that had once set them alight? As the days wore on, Daniel could only wait, caught in the tension of the unknown. There was no clear path ahead, no map to guide him through the darkness. But in the silence, he held on to one hope, that somehow, some way, they would find their way back to each other. Chapter 16. Infinity in an instant. The sun rose over the horizon in a soft cascade of light, a light so warm and golden that it seemed to breathe life into the very air. The ocean, still and serene, reflected the early morning rays, its calm surface broken only by the occasional ripple. It was a new day, and yet the feeling in the air seemed timeless, as though the world itself had held its breath and was now exhaling, ready for something new to unfold. Daniel stood on the beach, his feet sinking slightly into the cool sand. He had been here before, many times, but today was different. Today, the island no longer felt like a place of distance and disconnection. It no longer felt like a cage, a prison where he was trapped by the weight of his own doubts and regrets. Instead, it felt like a space of possibility, a place where things could change. And for the first time in a long time, he felt ready for change. The gentle waves lapped at the shore, their rhythmic sound soothing the restless thoughts that had plagued him for so long. He had spent so many nights lying awake, wrestling with his fears, with his uncertainty about where they stood, about whether the love they shared could survive the chasm that had formed between them. And yet, in this moment, standing here on the beach with the sun rising over the water, he felt something shift deep inside him. He felt a glimmer of hope, a quiet, steady pulse of belief that things could be different, that they could find their way back to each other. His eyes scanned the horizon, the vast stretch of ocean that seemed to go on forever, and for the first time in months, he didn't feel small in the face of it. He didn't feel as though he were drowning in the overwhelming weight of their differences. Instead, he felt like he was part of something much larger, something bigger than himself. The island, the ocean, the sky. It all seemed connected in a way that he had never truly understood before. And in that moment, He realized that their differences weren't obstacles to overcome. They were the very things that made them unique, that made their love special. The challenge wasn't in changing each other, but in learning to embrace the things that made them who they were. As he stood there, a familiar presence at his side caught his attention. Without turning, he knew it was Evelyn. He could feel her before he saw her, as if her presence was woven into the very fabric of the world around him. The air seemed to shift when she arrived, as though the universe itself had aligned, bringing them together at this precise moment in time. He could hear the soft crunch of her footsteps on the sand, the gentle sway of her presence in the still morning air. When she stood beside him, there was no need for words. They simply existed in the space between them, two souls caught in a dance of unspoken understanding. The tension that had once been so palpable, so heavy, seemed to dissipate in the quiet of the dawn. There were no more barriers, no more walls between them. Just the gentle, reassuring presence of one another. Together, they watched the sun continue its slow climb into the sky, the light spreading across the ocean in a wide arc. The world was awakening, and with it, so were they. The past was still there, lingering in the corners of their minds, but it no longer defined them. The silence that had once been a chasm between them was now filled with something softer, something more forgiving. It was the silence of two people who had come to understand that love wasn't about perfection. It was about embracing each other, flaws and all. Daniel reached out, his hand brushing against hers, and for a moment, time seemed to pause. There was no rush, no need to fill the space with words. There was only the quiet comfort of their touch, a simple connection that spoke volumes. The feeling that had been missing for so long, the warmth, the intimacy, returned with a quiet intensity. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was everything they needed. It was a promise, unspoken but understood, that they were in this together, no matter what. The day unfolded slowly, with the steady rhythm of the waves in the background and the soft hum of the world coming to life around them. As the hours passed, Daniel and Evelyn found themselves walking along the beach, side by side, no longer weighed down by the unspoken words that had once kept them apart. The distance between them had closed, not through grand gestures or dramatic confessions, but through the simple act of being present, of accepting each other as they were, differences and all. They didn't need to say much. The connection between them, the bond they had built over time, was enough. It was a quiet understanding that what they had was special, that they had been brought together not by chance, but by something deeper, something that had always been there, beneath the surface, waiting for them to realize it. As the sun began to set, casting its warm glow across the horizon once more, Daniel and Evelyn sat together on the sand, watching the colors of the sky shift from soft golds to deep purples. The world around them was changing, but so were they. The differences that had once seemed like barriers now felt like the threads that wove them together, creating a tapestry that was uniquely theirs. They didn't know what the future held. They didn't need to. For the first time in a long time, they were content to simply be, to exist in this moment, with the promise of whatever would come next. The road ahead was uncertain, but they knew one thing for sure. They were no longer alone in it. Their love, imperfect and mismatched as it was, had endured. And in that endurance, there was beauty. As the stars began to twinkle above them, the soft whispers of the ocean echoing in the distance, they sat in peaceful silence, side by side. The world had been transformed, and so had they. They were no longer the people they had been when they first arrived on the island, but they were something more now. Together, they were a new dawn,